You're listening to Proven Perspectives, a podcast with John Hawkins, the founder of Leadership Edge. I'm Laura, John's daughter, and in each episode, we'll explore a topic related to life, leadership, or mentoring. Through over 50 years of faith in Christ, John has learned proven life and leadership perspectives that will equip listeners for a lifestyle of leadership in their marriages, families, careers, communities, and churches. Hey, Dad.
Hey, it's great to hear your voice and get to actually see you online. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I feel like this is the first time I've seen you since our super fun wedding weekend in Indiana last weekend.
That was so much fun. It was a great time for family all the way around.
Totally. Yeah. And a beautiful wedding. And I really enjoyed getting to meet Kara's family. So.
Yes.
Anyways, and now you guys are about to head off on your next adventure.
Oh, we are. We leave this Saturday for a 7-night Mexican Riviera cruise out of the Los Angeles port. So we're all excited about that. We'll go to Puerto Vallarta and to Cabo San Lucas and to Ensenada, and then have a few days just at sea, as they say. So it's going to be a good break for us before we get back and do some traveling to Texas and then to San Francisco.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited for our topic today because this is an area of your life that I feel like, as you've started talking about some of the books that you're reading or some of the things that you're thinking about, I can tell like that I don't feel like I really understand this topic yet. And so both as a person who cares about you and just wanting to kind of learn, I'm really interested to hear what we're going to talk about. So you tell our listeners, what have you been reading about recently?
Well, I bet of all of our listeners, I'm probably the only one who has been reading what I've been reading. But as you know, Laura, I am 68, moving on to 69, and definitely
a baby,
feeling some of the age and health kind of things. And so I decided maybe I need to start reading some books on aging. And so I've been reading, 3 or 4 different books from different kinds of authors, and then also some just articles or briefer pieces about what it's like to age and what it means and how do you do it well and faithfully. And one thing I've learned is there's not just one stage of old age, there's actually 3 stages of old age.
Interesting. So what are the 3 stages?
Well, they are young old, which is 65 to 75. There is old, which is 75 to 85. And then there is old, which is 85 to death. And I do want
are these like
everyone to know that I am very much in the early end of young old. So just want to make sure all of our listeners understand.
Okay.
This.
I mean, you're hardly even qualified to talk about
No,
you're
just
that
a
young.
babe.
That is hilarious. Well, and yeah, I know I kind of said this a little bit already, but I am just really interested to hear about this because you are really, I can tell that this is a really significant kind of season change, and especially probably over the next, when you get more into old.
Which I'm very far away from.
So decades away. So yeah, but as a person who cares about you personally, but then also I think, I've always kind of looked at your life as sort of, a general model of this is the direction I want to be headed. And so I feel like even though, like our season of life looks really different, it's not, it's one generation away. So I'm really, and I think for other listeners too, this is a helpful thing to kind of get some bearings on. So thanks for sharing about this today.
Oh, I'm super glad to. And yeah, we definitely get that a lot of our listeners are not in the stages of old. But I remember leadership expert Stephen Covey, he said that we should always begin with the end in mind. And I think that is true with our lives as well, that we need to, in our 20s and our 40s and our 50s and 60s, we need to be living lives that are pointing towards the kind of people that we want to be in our older years. And so I think for our younger listeners today, there's going to be plenty for them to reflect on in terms of, okay, if this is what faith and faithfulness looks like in your later years, what does that mean about how I need to be living now? So, yeah, I think it's going to be very relevant.
Awesome. Well, and yeah, you kind of just alluded to like the different decades, but that was one of the first things I wanted to ask you about. Like, how does this learning about old age fit with your thoughts on the decades of adult life?
Yeah, well, my thoughts about the decades of adult life are not original to me. I've heard different versions, different iterations of them from many different speakers. But the way I tend to think about it is I tend to think for adults, the decade of your 20s is especially about formation. And it's kind of the years where you're getting training in different areas, a lot of times training in your job, sometimes spiritual training. You're also learning to develop your skills, and whatever you learned in college or in trade school, you're learning to put into practice. And it's also a decade where those beliefs that you've lived around of maybe your parents' faith or the church that you grew up in, that those beliefs are needing to actually become convictions in your life. So the 20s are a decade of formation, of things coming together, of training, development, and convictions. And then I think the 30s and 40s, I tend to lump them together. And I just say that it's a 20-year period of learning a lot about God-dependent endurance, where your life is getting more complicated, you have more responsibilities, you're married, you have kids, your job's moving on, you're involved in your church, your community, and it's just a busy, what I call the go-go years. And a lot of times we laugh about that you need to really learn endurance in your 30s because you're going to need it to get to your 40s. And so then we get to 50, and I tend to think of 50 to 70 as your years of greatest service and influence. As you get to 50, you'll have a lot of the wisdom that you're going to have to offer to others. You'll have more flexible time, usually. You'll have some financial resource or freedom, most likely. You'll have a lot to give back. And instead of looking at 50 to 70 as those years that you just kind of start living soft and, just only do things you want to do, you're thinking about those 20 years as your time of greatest service, greatest influence. And then we get into the later years, 70 and beyond, where your focus there is not formation, it's not endurance, it's not greatest service and influence. Your focus there is finishing well, that you really want to be someone who finishes well. So does that make sense in terms of how the decades of adult life point towards 70 and beyond being the years of finishing well?
Totally. And I think the finishing well idea is one that, I have a number of questions for you about that. But before we move on to that, I was thinking it's interesting, like the last episode that we did was about kind of how God, it seems like over the decades up to a certain point, he's building your dependence and reliance on him and your relationship with him through increasing responsibilities. And so it's interesting. It sounds like what you're saying is, and then in this season, you're learning dependence and reliance on God in just a totally different way. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think so. I think that you still have responsibilities that God wants you to carry in your 70s and beyond. But you also are at a time where the older you get, the more help you'll need in fulfilling your responsibilities. And so I heard one Christian speaker say one time that God gives us old age to teach us humility. And I think that's true because you've always been someone who, can get it done. And then, if you get real old and real feeble, you can get less and less done. And a lot of times you need people's help to do that. So it's an interesting transitional kind of period.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, so I feel like this is some helpful background. And so then I'd like to focus the rest of our discussion on a couple of things. The first thing is, I'd like to hear more from you about what you mean when you talk about finishing well and what that would look like in, life, leadership, and mentoring. And then secondly, I'd like to hear a little more from you about what this has to do with, people who are maybe a generation or more away from young old. So maybe we can take it to those two places. What are your thoughts about finishing well?
Well, it's an interesting concept, the idea of finishing well. Finishing what well? I guess it's finishing my life well, finishing my time on earth well. But I think just like every other part for a Christian, as we're talking about finishing well, we have to look at it from a God-centered view. Like, what would God say it looks like to finish well? So it's not just, that I've remained faithful to the end and that my family still loves me and that, I'm generally regarded well in the community. I think it can be those things, but I think it's more than that. A couple of verses that come to my mind. One is Psalm 92, verses 12 through 14. It says, "The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God." And then it says, "They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green." And isn't that interesting to think about older people who, have lived so much of their life, but they still bear fruit. They're still full of sap, full of life energy. So it seems like one of the things that it says here that God has in mind for those of us in our later years in terms of finishing well is that we're still living a fruitful life. And in the Bible, that's always related to dependence upon God because the fruit has to come from Him through us. So bearing fruit in our old age, both in the fruits of the Spirit and how they're lived out in our lives as we get older, but also fruit in other people's lives as we're a blessing to them, as we're an encouragement to them. So that's been a good verse in terms of what does it mean to God for me to finish well? But then also in Psalm 71, 18 to 19, it says, "So even to old age and gray hairs, O God, do not forsake me until I proclaim your might to another generation, your power to all those to come. Your righteousness, O God, reaches the heavens. You who have done great things, O God, who is like you?" So the author here is saying, God, kind of keep me here and keep your hand upon me until I've proclaimed your might to another generation, until I've proclaimed your power to all those to come. And then he just breaks into worship where he says, "Your righteousness, O God, reaches the high heavens. You who have done great things, O God, who is like you?" So that it's telling me here that what God has in mind for a life that finishes well is one that is a faithful witness, that until their last days, they are proclaiming to those who don't know Jesus just about the goodness of God and the goodness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But for those who do know Jesus, being a witness to them, reminding them again and again as to who God is. So when I think about finishing well, I try to think about it not in terms of what do I hope or what does it mean to me? But I try to think about it in terms of God. And it seems like two things I conclude from that is He wants me to be a faithful follower to Him all the days of my life. And He wants me to be a faithful witness for Him to the very end. So those are some things that come to my mind as I think about this whole finishing well kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it was interesting to me, like two things that stood out from what you said. One is the idea, because I think I would tend to, just hearing those words, think finishing well just meant like not like ruining your witness and like continuing to be a person who lives by faith. And it sounds like you're saying both of those things are part of it. But it was interesting that one of the things that you talked about was just like kind of being characterized as by like praise towards God and being fruitful.
Yes.
So, and another thing that you said that really stood out was that a fruitful life always flows out of dependence on God. So I guess just a quick follow-up question for you. If you're kind of in the transition between those two, like kind of more your 50s and 60s into young old, what are you doing now to kind of prepare for that? Or like, what is, I don't know. what are you doing now to kind of get ready?
Well, fortunately, I'm still in great health and am able to do pretty much anything I want to do. I think I'm still pretty good mentally. I haven't had
You totally
anyone
are.
tell me otherwise. So,
You regularly beat me on Quirtle.
so it's one of those things where, for me now at 68, I know what's coming. I know that ultimately I'll go and be with him forever. But between now and then, it's going to be more challenging. There'll probably be some health decline. There may be some mental decline. I may be more and more dependent on others. And so instead of, fearing those or trying to figure all those out now, I'm just musing some in terms of, okay, God, how do I trust you as those come along? Like, how do I, in a sense, yield to the years that he has for me, realizing that, for most of us, there's not many easy pathways out of this life. Some of us, maybe die of a heart attack or something and, immediately transition to be with him. But for others of us, there can be years of declining health. There can be years of declining mental health. There can be financial pressures, all kinds of things. And so it's like I feel like I'm on the mountain peak, kind of looking out to what's ahead for me and just looking to God as to the daily faith and faithfulness I need to prepare for the adventure ahead.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Dad. And so let's look at this through the lenses of life, leadership, and mentoring.
Okay.
So for you, how does finishing well shape how you think through your everyday life? Or like, what difference does it make in how you think about and live your days?
Well, I think with daily life now, I'm more aware that my days are numbered. That maybe I have a couple of more decades. Maybe I only have today. I don't know. But what it reminds me of is I need to live for him today. I need to know him today. I need to trust in him and rest upon him today. And that it could be that today's all I've got. Or again, it could be I've got decades ahead. But whatever man I'm going to be, whatever way I'm going to be finishing faithfully and finishing well, the only moment in which I have to do that is this moment, in this day. So dealing with, today for me is a packed out day. My first meeting was at 8 a.m. and I'm pretty back to back until about 5:30 tonight. And so there's stresses that come with, meeting after meeting and all the things that are kind of screaming at me in between the meetings. And yet, if I'm going to be his man, if I'm going to live faithfully for him, if I'm going to be in these years finishing well, it means really learning and fighting and wrestling with doing it now, doing it in this moment. Because, you don't have like, God doesn't give you like, okay, you've got 3 more days or 5 more years. So you really need to get serious now, or you really need to get focused now. You don't know how much time you got left, but you know that you can be in his presence in this moment today. And we were talking earlier about, so what's the relevance of this for our listeners who are maybe in their 20s, 30s, and 40s? They're going to be like, man, I've tuned into the geriatric hour or something. But I think one of the implications is, if that's what it means now, in my life now as someone in their late 60s, that's how I need to be living in my 20s and 30s and 40s, of living for him now, living for him in this moment, trusting him for strength now. Because just like I said, God's not going to tell me 5 days in advance that I've only got 5 days left. And with our younger listeners, kind of similarly, you don't want to kind of live a life where, from 20 to 65, you just kind of live however, but then at 65, you're going to get really serious, get really focused. You want to be living that way all the way along.
Yeah. Like it can't be built overnight. It's day by day.
Exactly. Because what we're aiming for is a seamless kind of life where if you take a slice of who I am in my 20s and a slice of who I am in my 70s, it's pretty much the same stuff. Hopefully I'm growing, I'm learning, I'm getting wiser and hopefully more godly. but it's the same man heading in the same direction, regardless of what decade.
Man, no, that's really good. And so, like, with what you just said, it makes me think, yeah, it both inspires me to be building toward, I mean, really towards eternity, I guess, but towards, like the end in sight. And it also makes me think for people, of my generation, how much we need friends and mentors who are where you are. Because I was thinking, I mean, we need to be cultivating it ourselves and aligning ourselves with, the end in mind. But I mean, even this morning, I had sent you and Mom a text about a meeting Adam and I need to go to. And I mean, you're reminding me today of the things that I know you must be reminding yourself of just instead of looking to my own resources. How many times have we had this conversation, Dad? But instead of looking,
at least we're
maybe
consistent.
by the time I'm old, I'll get it. But like instead of relying on my own resources to look to God, I don't need to figure out how I'm going to handle it. I need to figure out what's my responsibility and what can only God do, and then live in that reality. Yeah. So it's just, you're such a gift to me in so many ways, but that's definitely a big one. Wow. Anyways, so I guess we kind of talked about what it looks like in life. How does finishing well shape your understanding of yourself as a leader?
Yeah, well, my mind on leadership, and this is what we teach in Leadership Edge, is that leadership is largely a process of interpersonal influence. It's not so much a position that you hold. It's more the godly, God-honoring influence that God's given you and how you use that with others to help move things along to accomplish God's purposes. So I think that as you get older, you begin to step down, you begin to step away. At Leadership Edge 5 years ago, I stepped down from being the president, and Todd's now our president, doing amazingly good work for us. But,
totally.
I, in so much of life, I'm no longer the front guy. I'm no longer up front. And so you learn a lot about this phrase called leading from behind, which sometimes that phrase has kind of ruffled my feathers a little bit. But I think you learn to have influence, but you're having it from kind of behind the scenes, behind others. You're still influencing, but you're not the guy or the woman up front. And you have to learn that. You have to learn, so what does that look like for me to kind of lead or influence from behind? Then another thing I'm learning is that a lot of my leadership now is by following and submitting, to where the Leadership Edge, again, I'm no longer the president. I follow Todd's leadership. I submit to Todd's leadership. In the church that you and your family and Jenna and I are part of, Seabreeze here, a lot of my involvement is behind the scenes or in kind of menial service places. And a lot of my influence is hopefully being a godly example of following the pastors and leaders at our church and submitting to the pastors and leaders of our church in biblical kinds of ways. And that's still leading because, hopefully it's setting a good example for others to follow. But it is a transition. And I think that as an older leader, if your identity has been tied into a position or a title or a certain level of status, you're going to have all kinds of problems, and you're probably going to drive some people crazy. But if you're willing to learn the lessons of leading from behind and leading by, following and submitting, then God can use you in amazing ways. And you can be a great resource, both to the leaders of the organizations of which you're a part, but also to those who are just members of the organization. I think that leading in my marriage, with Janet, I'm still the husband. And as the Bible says, I'm still the head of Janet. And yet I think that in these years, the leadership that we have is probably a lot more cooperative and just kind of figuring things out together. Janet still looks to me.
I can see that in you guys.
Yeah, to be the head. But, we've lived together 45 years now. And we know each other. We love and trust each other. And so it's a lot more of a conversation between us than probably ever before. And that seems right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that has been one of the things that has been neat since you guys moved here is as I've observed your day-to-day life, just like after all of these decades, I guess this is just one more area of like building day after day. But you guys really do have like a sweet friendship,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really cool that's just a cool thing to see.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Lord's blessed us with that. That's for sure.
So, Dad, I know that you're still mentoring a number of men. What does mentoring look like when you're in your finishing well years?
Well, it is increasingly a wonder to me. Like this afternoon, I will be in a mentoring meeting over Zoom with a junior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we've been meeting now for, I think, over a year. And I keep thinking, why does this make sense to him? Like, I am as old or maybe older than his grandfather, and it's just like,
but you're still young.
Yeah, it's just like, how does this still work? But what's so interesting is with the guys that I mentor who mainly are in their 20s and 30s, I feel like in some ways I have even more value to them because I think that at least within guys, there really is a longing to finish well and to look at older men who are finishing well and not perfectly, but who have set that as their ambition, as their goal by God's grace. And so I think it encourages them that you can get to, heaven help us, 68 years old and still be walking well with the Lord. So it's interesting that it still works. But I think as the mentor, you have to be careful about a couple of things. You have to make sure that you don't get into what I call kind of the dump truck kind of thing of, oh, I've got all these experiences and, no one else wants to listen to them. So I'm just going to sit you down and tell you all the great stories of my life. So you don't want to do that. And then you also don't want to move into fixing people. Like, oh, I know exactly where you're at, Jack, and this is what you need. And you better start doing it today. Like, maybe you've been where he's at, doubtfully, I don't know, but you don't necessarily know everything he needs. And in some ways, you need to help him learn the things he needs from God and to hear those things from God and not just be kind of put in his place by you. So I think that amazingly, there's a lot of desire for younger men to spend time with older guys like me. But as the older guy, I have to keep remembering I'm there to be their servant. I'm there to point them to Jesus. And I want to share with them any things God's given me. But we're really just two brothers in Christ kind of figuring it out together.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, and Dad, one thing, like I know earlier you talked about, you've been walking with God for 52 years. And even in this last question, you were talking about just people want to see what it looks like after decades of walking with God. We've kind of circled around this, but I would just be interested to hear you share, like, what is your relationship with God like in this season, just as far as like, as a lot of things around you are starting to shift, like, what is that like in your time with God or in your relationship with God? Does that make sense what I'm asking you?
Yeah, it does. I remember a friend that you and I have in common, a man named Neil Walker, who's a campus ministry in the Los Angeles area. I heard him talking a few months ago, and he was talking about a Christian man who's older than both Neil and myself. And he had asked that guy, who now thinks in his 80s, what his walk with God is like now. And the comment that the man made was, it's much more like a friendship. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, because God certainly calls us, to be his friends, which is remarkable. But as I've reflected on that in my own life, I do feel some of that. Like in the mornings when I'm generally alone and I'm reading the word, he's there with me and he speaks to me from his word and he gives me the reminder of his love for me and his presence there with me. And he gives me something from his word every day that just cheers me on to believe and to follow
That's cool.
and to long for him. And so I don't know if I'm quite there with Neil's friend, that every day what I think is just more and more like a friendship, but it is beginning to feel more like, and I attribute that just to his kindness and, condescending with me every day, like coming to me and allowing me to be his friend and his follower and his child.
And so can I ask just
Yeah.
one more quick thing? This is really cool. So like with that, what is causing that shift? Is it the longevity of the relationship? You now know his voice more clearly and he, he's just a closer friend, or is it something about the like particulars of this season of life?
I don't know exactly. Like I tend to think that everything that's good about my relationship with God is something that he's done, not necessarily anything I've done. But
Yeah.
I do.
That's good.
Yeah, I do think that it's just, as you mentioned, it's been 52 years and he has proven himself to me over and over and over again. And as I think I've said on other podcasts, it's not that I couldn't, walk away from him today. But if I were to do so, I would have to deny over half a century of his faithfulness to me. And so not only does that half a century of knowing his faithfulness is that like ballast to kind of keep me upright, but it also like fuels me towards him. Like I want to be with him because he has been faithful to me. So I don't know how much to explain it beyond that.
Well, I feel like this is a great place to wrap up. I feel like I'm leaving this podcast of knowing like that's what I want,
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts for our younger listeners? Like any wrap up encouragements or words of wisdom?
Well, I think for our younger listeners, again, whether you're in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe early 60s, you have to focus on the challenges and responsibilities of today in your life. You have to focus on, walking with God and believing God today in your life. But I hope that it also helps you to kind of lift up your eyes every now and then and think, Lord willing, one day I'll be in my 60s, I'll be in my 70s, maybe in my 80s or my 90s. And how do I live my life now to where the person that I want to be then, the path I want to be on then, the fellowship with Christ and the knowledge of him that I want for those years, how can each day of my life, whether it's in my 20s, my 40s, or my 60s, how can each day be leading towards that? To where I've lived by his grace, not a perfect life, but I've lived a consistent life, moving towards him, following him, looking for his daily grace. And then you get to my age and you're like, yeah, I really have known him. And I really have walked with him. And I really have been used by him to be a blessing to others. So I hope for our younger listeners, kind of the picture, the vision of their later years will fuel you now and how you live today so that you'll be in path towards that part of your life.
And that's good. Well, and I feel like that's just such a great thing for me to pray for me and Adam and our kids even, of like, God, move us closer to you today. Thanks for sharing this. Dad, would you wrap us up?
Oh, be glad to. The vision that I have for my life is the vision that we teach at Leadership Edge. It's called the Life Vision Statement, and it's by God's grace to step forward as God's man or woman in my spheres of influence to serve his purposes for his glory. And I lived that out in my 40s and 50s and early 60s by his grace, and I still live according to that vision, knowing that now I'm kind of in that season of finishing well around that vision. So if you'd like more information about our life vision statement, about any of our other resources on leadership development or on mentoring, please go to our website and you'll find some great resources there. Thanks for listening to us today.
Thanks, Dad. And thanks, listeners, for joining us.
Listeners, if you would like more perspectives on life, leadership, and mentoring, please go to the Leadership Edge website at lead-edge.com. Or if you have questions or ideas about future podcasts, please reach out to us at lei@lead-edge.com. We look forward to hearing from you.